Hello, sixth graders. Today we're taking a look at lesson 5, the opposite of a number's opposite. And we're going to learn a little bit about how we can read things as opposite of and negative, how they're similar and interchangeable, but yet different, okay? And you're going to be able to locate and position the opposite numbers on a number line. So looking at page 41 in your book, we're looking at number 1. It says locate the number -2 and its opposite. So really easy to do. Let's go ahead and plot that. Go over, plot our point for -2. And its opposite, well, we learned that if it was 2 units to the left, the opposite is 2 units to the right. And we go ahead and plot that also. Next one. It says write an integer that represents each of these following. Well, 90 feet below. How do we write that? You got it, -90. And what about $100 of debt? What do we know about debt? Yeah, debt's a bad thing, right? So that would be a negative. So again, it's -100. And what about 2 degrees Celsius above 0? If it's above, is it negative or positive? Positive. Do we need to write it? No. We don't need to write a plus sign, just the number 2. And number 3 says Joe is at the ice cream shop and his house is 10 blocks north of the shop. The park is 10 blocks south of the shop. When he is at the ice cream shop, is Joe closer to the park or his house? And how could the number 0 be used in this situation? So for me, it's a whole lot easier to always graph or draw a diagram for it. So I'm going to go ahead and here is the ice cream shop. And we know his house is 10 blocks north, and north is above. So we know that this distance right here is 10 blocks, and this is his house. And then we know that the park is 10 blocks south of the ice cream shop. So if we go this direction, we also have 10 blocks. And this is the park. And the question says, when he's at the ice cream shop, which is he closer to? Kind of obvious, right? He's the same distance. And what did we say that that was called when we're just doing how far it is, the distance of? Right, absolute value, right? So we want to remember that. And also remember that how we represent absolute value are just 2 vertical straight lines. And in this case, we could say it was 10 away from it. Now, what does 0 represent? What does the number 0 represent? Yeah, right here is 0. So what's it represent? 0 means you're at the ice cream shop. Perfect. All right, let's go ahead and keep looking. Now, the next example says, what is the opposite of the opposite of 8? And how can we illustrate this number on a number line? Well, what number is 8 units to the right of 0? Perfect. So it is 8, right? And how can you illustrate locating the opposite of 8 on the number line? If you had to illustrate, what does illustrate mean you're going to do? Right? Draw, right? You would have to draw. So it said, how could you illustrate? Does it say you have to? No. So how would you find the opposite of 8? Yeah, you would have to count 8 units to the left of 0. Right? Because if this is to the right 8 units, we need to go the opposite 8 to the left. So what is the opposite of 8? -8. Use the same process to locate the opposite of negative 8. So it wants us to use this nice little number line. So I'm going to go ahead and label these. Remember that we are labeling the lines, not the spaces. And if this is my negative 8, which is where I'm at right here in C, I'm at negative 8, and we want to know the opposite of negative 8. Well, the opposite is 8 to the other side. So instead of going 8 here and being at 0, we would have to go 8 on the other side, and we would land on positive 8. So the opposite of a number is important, the original number. So the opposite of a number. Opposite of a number. Crazy, right? All right, so we're going to take a look here, and we're not going to use cards. We're going to go ahead, and I'm going to pick some people here. We're going to say that Jordan and Jaden and Piper and Haley. Okay, so I just picked a couple kids, and I'm going to say that when I gave you these cards, okay, Jordan had a 4, Jaden had 150, Piper had a -6, and Haley had a -9. So I need to take a look at this and find out how would I write the opposite of that card, the opposite. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my numbers in a parenthesis, okay? That's where I'm going to start because that's my original number. Now I want the opposite of that. So a negative sign out front represents opposite. Okay, so that is the representative of opposite. So I need to say, what's the opposite of 4? -4. What's the opposite of 150? -150. What's the opposite of -6? Just +6, right? And the last one is the opposite of -9 is +9. So now let's take a look and say, well, what's the opposite of the card? So I'm going to go ahead and start with the card again. So here was the opposite card. So we have a -4. We have a -150. We have a +6. And we have a +9. And we want the opposite of those. So when we do that, what's the opposite of -4? +4. What's the opposite of -150? +150. Opposite of a +6? -6. And an opposite of a +9 is a -9. Now I also want to show you that these down here could have also been written like this, and it's going to seem kind of odd, I think, to you. So we started with just this -6, and then we took the opposite of it, and then we had to take the opposite of that. So there's where we have our 3 negative signs. And when we have 3 negative signs, an odd number of negatives is going to stay a negative, which is where we started. So the same thing with this 9, same exact thing. We would have 3 negative signs because we would have a -9, the opposite of it, and then the opposite of that. So it says, number 1, write the opposite of -10 as an equation. So write the opposite of -10. So we have -10, and we want the opposite of that. And then we want the opposite of that. So again, if I wanted to do that, I could put another negative here. All right, so let's go ahead and look. Well, what's the opposite of negative 10? This right here would make it a positive 10. And then what's the opposite of positive 10? Negative 10. In general, the opposite of a number is the original number. We already said that, right? Now, provide a real-world example of this. Something like the opposite. I'm going to write it above because I don't have a lot of room. The opposite of 100 feet below sea level is 100 feet below sea level. So let's take a look. The opposite of 100 feet below, because look, if we have an opposite here, and this means a negative, right? So this is a negative, this is a negative. So the opposite of an opposite so there's my negative 100, there's my below, and the opposite of that is 100. So negative 100 or positive 100, if they're still below, they're below sea level anyway. And we're going to go ahead and head back to the classroom.